Behind me is an image of the lady I want to talk about today, and that is a professional career criminal from South London called Zoe Proggle. Now, I do apologise if I'm butchering her name. I have no idea how to pronounce it. Progl. Proggle. She's someone that I'd never heard about, and someone that I mean, she has a Wikipedia page, but it is actually quite hard to find information about her. She's been written about in several novels, and she did publish her own autobiography. But apart from that, she's not really mentioned when female criminals of the 50s and 60s are talked about. We often hear a lot about the craze, don't we? Films made about the craze, etc. Mad Frankie Fraser, a lot of the male criminals, but we don't hear so much about the women. And Zoe was rubbing shoulders with the likes of the craze. So she was born in 1928 in Lambeth to a South London family. She was brought up in a Limehouse slum in East London. So she was brought up in poverty, really. Her father was known for being an alcoholic and apparently was dabbling in criminality. So Zoe, from a very young age, would, be exposed to this kind of thing and not having enough to eat, etc. It was a tough childhood and probably had a huge impact on what she ended up doing later in life. So she, from the age of 6, was stealing to feed herself, basically. From a teenager, she started working in Woolworths and then she started working in nightclubs. And that's where she sort of met a lot of the criminal underworld of London at that time and learnt how to rob and shoplift and steal and burglarise, etc. So she learnt all the tricks of the trade and I think came pretty addicted to it. I think also a big influence on her was the fact that in World War II, in 1940, she was evacuated to the country to a very rich family and she saw how the other half lived and she wanted to live that way. She didn't want to live in the abject poverty. She wanted to drag herself out of there by any means necessary. She was apparently sexually abused at some point as a child as well, and that must have had a big impact on her too. Um, she ended up, the first thing she did was marry a US sailor. That didn't last long. She then met a Canadian criminal and she learned all about the criminal world from him. She assisted him on many heists. She was often the one driving the getaway car, etc., and helping him steal things. So she learned the ways. She spent several stints in prison. She didn't think so. She thought that she would get a lighter sentence, being that she was 3 months pregnant. This was in 1947, but she actually got 3 month sentence in Borstal. So her son was born in Borstal, and it's also in Borstal that she learned a lot more tricks from the criminals that were in there. So much for detention centres and reform centres, eh? So when she came out, she had an affair with another gangster. She had another child by him. And she started learning how to go into jewellers. And her way of this was one of her techniques. She would go into jewellers, affect a posh accent, and ask to see their most expensive diamond rings, and then steal the diamond rings using an accomplice as a distraction technique. She was sent to prison several times over the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. She had her third child in 1957. She also got involved in drugs, which is interesting. She got involved in that scene. There was, contrary to popular belief, there was a lot of cocaine, heroin, and marijuana around in the 50s. And she got very involved in that and lots of the wild sex parties that were taking place at the time as well. Of course, all controlled by gangsters and gangland, etc. In 1960, she was arrested and she was, while she was out on bail, awaiting to see what she would get. She assumed she'd be sent to Holloway Prison because she'd already been in Holloway Prison before. She visited Holloway with her boyfriend to try and figure out an escape route for when she actually got put in there. And she did. She figured it out. She planned it all out that she was going to jump over the wall, that was going to be a rope ladder there, and she would jump into the getaway car and escape. And sure enough, she was sentenced to 2.5 years in in Holloway Prison. And while she was in there, she started planning her escape. She was the model prisoner while she was in there, so she didn't, raise any suspicions. And she escaped, and she actually holds the accolade of being the first woman to escape from Holloway Prison in that fashion. She then dyed her hair a different colour and fled to Brighton's to escape detection. But she was eventually 40 days later found and rearrested. And she was sent back to Holloway. On top of the 2.5-year sentence, she was given a further 18 months. So while she's in prison this time, she's thinking, well, I have 3 children. I need to amend my ways. I need to reform. And she writes her autobiography in prison, which was apparently ruined by the news of the world. What a surprise, adding loads of salacious details, etc. She came out in 1964 and she married a sailor who very sadly beat her up, and she split from him as well, and then went back to robbery, stealing, kept being in and out of prison all the time until, she got presumably too old. And not much is known about her life sort of from the 70s onwards, really. We don't even know when she died. It's hard to find that information. It just says online before 2021. So she kind of faded into obscurity after that, it seems. Probably became too ill, I suppose. There's an image there, a photo of her and her last husband, the sailor that she ended up marrying, who beat her up. She's an interesting one, I think, because, like I say, I hadn't heard of her, and she's not alone. There's quite a few of these sort of women criminals of the 50s and 60s that, due to the misogyny of the time, are just not really talked about, not really mentioned much. Everybody knows the Krays, everybody knows the male criminals, but not so much the women. So that is why I wanted to do a tour about real female, London criminals. I focused on the 1800s with this one and the early Edwardian period. So Jailbirds of Old London, it's called, is running on the 2nd and 22nd of July, and we are selling tickets now. It's a 2-hour walking tour around the City of London, and we will be examining 4 true crime cases in detail, and they're all very, very different, committed by women. And we look at how they were received by society and the criminal justice system. So if you are interested in that and you're in London, then do book tickets and come along. It's only £15. It's 2 hours, and we will end you'll have the option certainly to end in a pub at the end of the tour, which is a lovely old Victorian tavern on the Strand, and we can have a pint in there afterwards. So it should be a nice evening. So that's it from me today. Thank you very much for listening.